Tonight, a family is demanding answers after the man accused of killing their loved one takes a plea deal. Police say Kenyatta Jones killed Morgan Bazemore and Alicia Hereford in 2021.
The victims were mother and daughter. The original charge was murder, but Jones has pleaded down to manslaughter. Alicia Ann has details on the change.
Thick as thieves. Mother and daughter, but very good friends, best friends.
Family members only have pictures to hold on to almost 2 years after their loved one's murders. Norfolk police say they responded to a shooting at Hunter Square Apartments on March 12, 2021, and found 23-year-old Morgan Bazemore and her mother, 52-year-old Alicia Hereford, shot to death in the parking lot.
Forever in our hearts.
Investigators later arrested Kenyatta Jones. Prosecutors charged him with 2 counts of second-degree murder and gun charges. They say Bazemore and Jones had an on-off relationship.
We have all been waiting and anticipating, trying to leave it, in the hands of justice.
But last week, Norfolk Commonwealth's attorney Ramin Fadahi says Jones agreed to a plea deal and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of voluntary manslaughter. Bazemore's aunt didn't want to go in front of the camera. She says prosecutors initially told her Jones could get 30 years in prison, but now after the deal, he may only get 8.
Our family is completely hurt and disappointed.
Fadahi couldn't say much about the case, but says, quote, "We made the offer as the best of a series of options based on the limited evidence we had." Bazemore's aunt says her family wants more answers about why this case didn't go to trial.
Something else needs to be done about this whole system, this whole corruption. How do you shoot 2 people and you walk away with 4 years? You can hit a geese or a dog and get more time. So how do you get just 8 years total for 2 beautiful souls?
Jones is scheduled for sentencing on July 14th. In Norfolk, Allison Basil, 13 News Now.
We also reached out to Jones's defense attorney for comment, and we are waiting to hear back.
Norfolk, Virginia. A quiet night, a parking lot, and 2 women whose lives were about to end in ways no one could have imagined. Neighbors heard the shouting first, voices rising in the dark. And then came the gunfire. When the smoke cleared, a mother and her daughter lay on the pavement, their futures erased in seconds. The scene was haunting. Police lights flickered against brick walls, casting long shadows over still bodies. Family members would later cry out in disbelief, clutching photographs as candles burned at a vigil. They weren't ready to say goodbye, because how could anyone be ready for this? And the question that hangs over this case is one that cuts deep. Why? Why would someone so close to them pull the trigger? Why would an argument turn into an irreversible tragedy? And why, in the aftermath, would justice feel so uncertain? This is not a simple story of crime and punishment. It is a story of trust, of betrayal, of silence where voices were needed most. It is a story that still leaves a family grieving and a community searching for answers. Tonight, we step into the night of March 12, 2021, and retrace the final moments of a mother and her daughter. We will uncover what led to that deadly confrontation and why the consequences have left so many asking if justice was ever truly served. 2 women, 1 man, a night that changed everything. Why were they killed? Let's find out.
Welcome to Twisted Crimes Files, where the darkest truths come to light. Stay with us for chilling stories you won't forget, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a case.
Alicia Ann Hereford was 52 years old, a Norfolk mother who had spent her life balancing work, family, and the quiet determination that comes from years of sacrifice. Her daughter, Morgan Bazemore, was only 23, still finding her path in the world, still shaping the life she dreamed of. On the night of March 12, 2021, both were discovered in the parking lot of Hunter Square Apartments on Gough Street, each struck down by gunfire. Norfolk police who arrived at the scene confirmed that neither woman survived. What began as an argument spiraled into tragedy, leaving 2 lives ended on the asphalt, surrounded by flashing lights and stunned neighbors. Norfolk is no stranger to violent crime. For years, the city has struggled with shootings that erupt from personal disputes, rivalries, and community tensions. Hunter Square Apartments, tucked along Gough Street, had seen its share of police activity, but the killing of a mother and daughter together shook the community with unusual force. Residents woke up that morning not to another headline, but to the realization that a family had been wiped out in a single night. Police quickly confirmed that this was not a random act. Witnesses spoke of an argument just before the gunfire, voices raised, tension cutting through the night air. Moments later, Alicia and Morgan lay fatally wounded, while the shooter fled in a vehicle. Within days, the name of the suspect surfaced: 29-year-old Kenyatta Ferrell Jones. For the Bazemore family, the devastation was doubled by the fact that this was not a stranger, not a faceless assailant in the dark. This was someone who had once been close, someone Morgan trusted. The question loomed heavily in the days that followed. Why would a man who was part of Morgan's life turn his weapon on her and her mother? What anger, what fear, or what motive could explain pulling the trigger not once, but multiple times? The central mystery became not only who was responsible. That answer came swiftly, but why two women had to die that night in Norfolk, and whether the justice system would be able to deliver what their family so desperately sought. Alicia Ann Hereford's life began far from the parking lot where it ended. Born and raised with a strong sense of family, she carried that responsibility into adulthood, becoming the anchor her children leaned on. Friends and relatives described her as protective, a woman who would not hesitate to put herself between her loved ones and harm. She was quiet but steady, known for her determination and the sacrifices she made over the years to keep her family stable. At 52, Alicia was the kind of mother who still saw her role as ongoing, guiding her children even as they stepped into adulthood. Her presence was felt in every family gathering, every milestone celebrated, and even in the ordinary days where her advice and care shaped the rhythm of her household. Her daughter, Morgan Bazemore, was just 23, standing at the threshold of life's bigger chapters. She had grown up under Alicia's watchful eye, the youngest voice in a family that often leaned on her energy. Morgan's friends remembered her laughter, her easy way of drawing people into conversation, and her ability to light up social gatherings. She was fiercely close to her mother, the kind of daughter who still turned to Alicia for guidance, even as she carved out her own identity. Those who knew her spoke of her ambition, her plans that were only beginning to take form. Morgan was in many ways typical of her age, balancing relationships, friendships, and dreams. Yet she carried herself with a maturity that made people see her as wise beyond her years. Together, Alicia and Morgan shared a bond that was visible to everyone around them. They were more than mother and daughter. They were confidants, companions, and often one another's greatest defender. That closeness became part of the reason their deaths were so shocking, because the thought of one being lost without the other seemed unthinkable. In life, they moved together, and in death, they were taken together. The community remembers them not through the violence that ended their lives, but through the ordinary moments they left behind. Alicia's steady encouragement, Morgan's laughter drifting across a room, the sight of the two of them arriving together at family gatherings. They were real people with stories, personalities, and dreams, not just names on a case file. And understanding who they were is essential to understanding why their loss devastated an entire family and a city already weary of violence. Morgan Bazemore's world was never just her own. Like so many young adults, her choices and relationships rippled outward into her family. When she became involved with 29-year-old Kenyatta Ferrell Jones, her mother, Alicia, watched closely. Jones was more than a passing acquaintance. He was Morgan's boyfriend, a figure who moved from the background of her life into the center. To outsiders, the relationship might have looked ordinary, even typical of a young woman finding her way, but beneath the surface there were tensions that family members sensed but could not always prevent. Kenyatta Jones was not a stranger to struggle. By the time he was with Morgan, he carried with him the weight of past troubles and an air that some saw as unpredictable. For Morgan, the relationship may have been part of her journey toward independence, a connection she was determined to manage on her own terms. For Alicia, however, it was something different. She had spent her life protecting her children, and now she saw her daughter bound to a man she was not sure she could trust. Friends said Alicia was never shy about voicing her concerns when it came to Morgan's safety, and those who knew her believed that her protective instincts remained sharp right up until the very end. What grew between Morgan and Kenyatta was complex, layered with the usual signs of affection and companionship, but shadowed by conflict that could turn quickly into arguments. Those arguments did not always stay private. Neighbors recalled hearing raised voices, tension seeping into the quiet of Norfolk nights. Like many relationships, there's had moments of closeness, photos, small displays of loyalty, times when love seemed to hold them together. But there are also cracks, disagreements, trust issues, and heated exchanges that revealed the volatility beneath the surface. For Morgan, who was just 23, the relationship became part of her everyday life, but it also carried risks she may not have fully seen. For Alicia, watching from a mother's perspective, those risks were clearer. She worried, she intervened, and she stood by her daughter in ways only a mother could, even when it meant putting herself directly into the line of conflict. It was this very dynamic, the bond between mother and daughter, and the presence of a man whose love was tangled with anger, though it ultimately set the stage for the night that changed everything. March 11th, 2021 began like any other Thursday for 52-year-old Alicia Ann Hereford. The morning air in Norfolk carried the cool stillness of early spring, the kind that hinted at warmer days ahead. She rose the way she always did, her movements practiced, her mind already on the tasks that filled her day. There were errands to run, bills to consider, and always her children to think about. For Alicia, being a mother never stopped, no matter how grown her children became. That morning, she placed calls, spoke briefly with family, and moved through the city's familiar streets, checking off her responsibilities one by one. Her daughter, Morgan Bazemore, woke that day in a different rhythm. At 23, her world was shaped by a mixture of plans and uncertainty, days that often stretched between work, relationships, and the conversations she carried with her friends. Those close to her remembered how she balanced energy and responsibility, a young woman who wanted independence, but who still leaned on her mother for grounding. On this day, as on many others, she found herself alongside Alicia, the two of them together in a rhythm they had never quite broken. By late afternoon, the streets around Norfolk pulsed with the usual energy. Traffic gathered at intersections, shop doors opened and closed, and voices filled the sidewalks. But for Alicia and Morgan, the world narrowed to the smaller details, picking up food, sharing a brief conversation in the car, speaking about the frustrations of life and the small joys that broke through. In moments like these, Morgan laughed easily, the sound spilling into the interior of Alicia's car, reminding her mother of the child she had once carried and the adult she had proudly raised. As dusk fell, the two of them made their way toward the Hunter's Square apartments. The sun's light drained slowly from the sky, leaving behind the glow of street lamps and the occasional flicker from apartment windows. Hunter's Square was familiar territory, rows of brick buildings, cars pressed in narrow parking spaces, the kind of place where voices traveled easily across the courtyard. It was here that Alicia and Morgan settled into their evening, talking, waiting, moving between their car and the lot in the hours before midnight. But as the night deepened, something shifted. The atmosphere that had felt ordinary only hours earlier began to thicken with tension. Kenyatta Ferrell Jones, Morgan's boyfriend, entered the scene. At first, it may have seemed like any other meeting, an exchange of words in a quiet lot, a conversation that drew no attention. But it grew quickly. Witnesses later recalled the sound of voices rising, carrying across the parking spaces, sharp words cutting through the stillness. For those who listened from windows or stairwells, it was impossible to mistake the argument for anything casual. The confrontation swelled, words thrown back and forth with urgency. Alicia's voice joined the exchange, steady and firm, the voice of a mother unwilling to let her daughter face conflict alone. She positioned herself near Morgan, not as a bystander, but as a shield. Morgan's voice, younger but equally fierce, rose to meet Kenyatta's, matching him in tone. The three of them formed a triangle of tension under the dim light of a street lamp, their silhouettes visible to anyone watching from the shadows. Time crawled in those moments. Neighbors described the argument as lasting long enough to pull their attention, long enough for someone parked nearby to switch on a dash camera, sensing that what was unfolding might spiral beyond control. In Morgan's pocket, her phone lit up with unanswered messages from friends who would never hear from her again. Alicia clutched her handbag, not knowing that inside rested a firearm that would never be drawn in her defense. Around them, Norfolk slept, unaware of the storm gathering in a single parking lot. Minutes stretched. The sound of Kenyatta's anger grew sharper, words striking with an edge that suggested more than frustration. Morgan stood her ground, her voice unflinching, while Alicia pressed closer, refusing to step back. Their argument twisted with history, with the strain of love and distrust, of warnings unheeded and choices defended. To those watching, it was impossible to separate motherly protection from the daughter's defiance, impossible to know which words might be the last they would ever speak. The night had reached a fragile stillness when the first sharp cracks split the air. Gunfire shattered the quiet, echoing off the brick walls of Hunter's Square, a sound that jolted neighbors awake and froze those who had been watching. In the span of seconds, the argument that had held 3 people in its grip ended in violence. Alicia fell first, her body crumpling onto the pavement, the force of the bullet tearing through the years she had lived, the years she had yet to see. Morgan, struck moments later, collapsed beside her mother, her voice silenced in an instant. The parking lot that had moments earlier been filled with raised voices now lay in silence. The air smelled of gunpowder, heavy and unmistakable. Kenyatta turned, climbed into his vehicle, and fled, leaving behind the still bodies of a mother and daughter who had stood together until their last breath. Tires screeched against asphalt, carrying him into the night, while the witnesses remained frozen in place, their fear locking them into silence. By the time midnight gave way to the early hours of March 12th, 2 lives had been extinguished. The parking lot of Hunter's Square was no longer just another apartment complex. It was a crime scene, a place where a mother's devotion and a daughter's youth ended under the same dim light, their final day collapsing into tragedy. When the gunfire stopped, silence took over Hunter's Square, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, heavy, as if the air itself had been torn apart and left in pieces. But silence never lasts long after violence. Within minutes, the first desperate calls flooded Norfolk's 911 lines. Frantic voices describing shots fired, people down, a man speeding away into the night. Dispatchers moved with practiced urgency, sending police units racing toward Gough Street. Blue and red lights began to slice through the darkness as patrol cars pulled into the narrow lot of the apartment complex. Officers stepped out quickly, weapons drawn, scanning for any sign of the shooter. Instead, their flashlights caught the still bodies of 2 women lying on the pavement. One, older, slumped near the front end of a parked vehicle. The other, younger, just feet away, motionless, her clothes stained with blood. Officers immediately called for medics, their voices clipped with tension over the radio. 2 victims down, multiple gunshot wounds. Paramedics arrived within moments, their sirens cutting through the sleeping neighborhood. They rushed to the women, kneeling on the cold ground, working with practiced speed. But it was already too late. Alicia Ann Hereford and her daughter, Morgan Bazemore, showed no signs of life. Medics tried briefly, checking pulses, lifting eyelids, placing monitors, but the gunfire had been merciless. Both women were declared dead at the scene. The paramedics stood for a moment, their gloves stained, their faces drawn, before covering the bodies with sheets. Around them, the parking lot transformed into a hive of controlled chaos. More patrol units arrived, followed by detectives. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across entrances, officers pushing back curious neighbors who had gathered in clusters, whispering in disbelief. Some stood crying openly, their hands over their mouths as the reality sank in. A mother and daughter gone in a single night. Detectives began their work under the glow of harsh floodlights that lit the lot like a stage. They marked spent shell casings scattered close to where the women had fallen. They examined the ground for footprints, tire marks, anything that might point to where the shooter had gone. Near Alicia's body, her handbag lay partly open, and inside, officers discovered a firearm. It had not been drawn. That detail would later become a shadow over the case, raising questions of self-defense versus aggression, questions that would follow the investigation into the courtroom. Forensics photographed every angle, capturing the scene from above, from the sides, zooming in on the bloodstains, the casings, the bodies still lying where they had fallen. Evidence markers dotted the pavement like small, silent witnesses. The dash camera video recorded by a neighbor was noted in the initial reports, a detail that investigators knew could prove crucial. But in those first hours, it was nothing more than one piece of evidence in a scene already overflowing with grief. Neighbors stood behind the tape, some shaking their heads, others whispering that they had heard shouting just before the shots. One woman told an officer that the argument had grown so heated, she knew something was about to happen. Another man admitted he had seen a car pull away fast after the gunfire, its taillights disappearing into the night. None of them, however, dared to say more in those first few hours. Fear hung over the apartment complex, as heavy as the smoke that lingered after the shots. By dawn, the parking lot was still cordoned off, the women's bodies finally removed by the medical examiner, their absence marked by chalk outlines and drying blood. The lot, once filled with ordinary noise, children playing, cars coming and going, was now a crime scene frozen in time. For the detectives, it was the beginning of a double homicide case. For the family of Alicia and Morgan, who would soon be notified by officers knocking on their doors, it was the moment their lives would never return to normal. The investigation began before the blood on the pavement had even dried. Detectives from Norfolk's homicide unit knew that in cases like these, the first 24 hours were critical. They worked quickly, canvassing the parking lot, speaking to residents who had peered from windows or cracked open doors when the shouting broke out. Some neighbors admitted they had seen everything from start to finish. Others said they only heard the gunfire. But the tension in their eyes told detectives something more: fear. Fear of being involved. Fear of what might come if they spoke too openly. Officers collected every piece of physical evidence they could. Spent shell casings were marked, numbered, and bagged. The ground was carefully photographed, each casing circled in chalk before being lifted and placed into envelopes for ballistics. Blood samples were documented, their patterns hinting at the position of the victims when the shot struck. The handbag containing Alicia's firearm was photographed, then sealed. It was an unsettling discovery, a gun present at the scene, still holstered in her bag, untouched. To investigators, it raised questions that would later loom over the entire case. Had Kenyatta Jones feared she might reach for it, or had he fired knowing she never would? Back at headquarters, detectives began piecing together what they had. The dash camera footage provided by a neighbor became a focal point. On its grainy screen, the confrontation could be seen unfolding. The raised gestures, the heated body language, the quick escalation, and then the eruption of gunfire. It was not just sound. It was a visual record of the moment two women's lives ended. But the evidence came with a caveat. For that footage to be used in court, the witness who recorded it would need to testify. Without their voice, the footage alone would not be admissible. Even in the early hours, prosecutors understood how fragile their case might become if fear kept witnesses silent. Detectives began searching for the suspect immediately. Kenyatta Ferrell Jones's name surfaced almost instantly from neighbors who knew Morgan's boyfriend. Witnesses described his car pulling out of the lot moments after the shooting. A bolo, be on the lookout, was issued, and officers worked through the night checking known addresses, speaking to associates, and tracking movements. For 4 tense days, the city held its breath. Then, on March 16, 2021, police located Jones in Norfolk. The arrest was swift and without incident. He was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of using a firearm in the commission of a felony. Inside the interrogation room, Jones sat under the harsh fluorescent lights, the weight of the charges heavy on his shoulders. He did not confess, but his defense became clear early on. He knew Alicia carried a gun, and he would later claim he feared for his life that night. The seed of self-defense was planted, a narrative that would shadow the prosecution for years to come. Meanwhile, autopsies confirmed what detectives already suspected. Alicia Ann Hereford had been shot 3 times. Her daughter, Morgan, had been struck twice, one of those wounds fatal to the head. The medical examiner's report described the trajectories, the distances, the brutal precision of the gunfire. For prosecutors, these details strengthened the case. Multiple shots fired at close range told a story of intent, not panic. But for the defense, the mere presence of Alicia's firearm allowed them to argue fear, even if that gun had never left her purse. As the months passed, investigators built their case. They prepared to rely on the dashcam footage, eyewitness testimony, forensic reports, and the ballistics linking shell casings to Jones's weapon. But one by one, cracks appeared. Witnesses who had initially spoken to police began to hesitate. Some stopped returning calls. Others openly admitted they were afraid to testify in court. Without them, the dashcam footage became unusable. Evidence that seemed so strong in the days after the shooting suddenly weakened under the weight of silence. For prosecutors, it was a sobering realization. The case they thought would be straightforward was unraveling. Without cooperation, the possibility of conviction on second-degree murder became uncertain. And in Norfolk, where violent crime was not uncommon, this was not the first time witnesses had disappeared when their testimony was needed most. The investigation had identified the shooter, collected the weapon, documented the crime, and confirmed the deaths. Yet the justice system required more. It required voices willing to take the stand. And without them, the path forward grew more complicated with each passing month. The grief began long before the courtroom doors ever opened. When word spread that Alicia Ann Hereford and her daughter Morgan Bazemore had been killed, the family was shattered. They had not just lost 2 relatives, they had lost their anchor in their light. At vigils, Alicia's son stood silently, candles reflecting in his eyes as others wept openly. Friends and neighbors shared memories, speaking of Alicia's strength and Morgan's laughter, but their voices always broke before the words could fully leave their mouths. They asked for justice, pleaded for accountability, and begged for answers that never seemed to come quickly enough. The Norfolk community rallied around them in those early days. Balloons floated into the night sky during vigils, candles flickered along sidewalks, and posters with smiling photos of Alicia and Morgan became symbols of lives that had ended too soon. Ministers offered prayers, while neighbors spoke to local news cameras, their voices trembling as they asked why a mother and daughter should die at the hands of someone they trusted. For the family, it was not only grief they carried, it was the bitter question of whether the justice system would do enough. Months passed, and the case inched toward trial. But what the family feared became reality. Witnesses who had once promised to testify grew silent, their cooperation fading under fear. The dash camera footage, so vital, could not be admitted without testimony. The prosecution, facing the possibility of watching the case collapse in front of a jury, made a painful choice. On March 3, 2023, the day before the trial was to begin, Kenyatta Ferrell Jones entered a plea of guilty to 2 counts of voluntary manslaughter. For the family, the words felt like betrayal. They had prayed for murder convictions, for sentences that reflected the gravity of losing 2 lives. Instead, they watched as the court accepted a plea that capped the punishment far lower than they had imagined. On July 14, 2023, Judge David W. Linetti sentenced Jones to 8 years in prison, with 12 additional years suspended, and a requirement of good behavior and supervised probation. 8 years for killing a mother and her daughter. The family wept, their cries echoing through the courtroom. To them, it felt like 2 lives had been reduced to a number that could never measure their worth. Commonwealth's attorney Ramin Fatehai stood by his decision, explaining that without witnesses, the case might have ended with no conviction at all. He called for a witness protection program in Virginia, admitting with open pain that he hated offering such a deal but could not risk Jones walking away free. His words were true, but they did little to soothe the family's anger. As if the grief was not enough, another shadow emerged from the case. In Alicia's BMW, police had discovered nearly $250,000 in cash and a small stack of counterfeit bills. The money sparked questions and rumors, a civil battle that stretched for years as the city held it as evidence. In 2025, the courts finally ruled that the money belonged to Alicia's estate, giving it to her son. But for many, the discovery raised questions that could never fully be answered. What was the money for? Why was it there? And did it have anything to do with the violence that took her and her daughter's lives? The aftermath of this tragedy was long and heavy. The Bazemore family faced not only the loss of Alicia and Morgan, but also public scrutiny, financial battles, and the crushing weight of a sentence they believed was far too light. Norfolk itself was left with haunting questions about justice. Was this justice? Did 8 years in prison equal the lives of a mother and daughter? Or was it another example of how silence and fear could weaken even the strongest cases? For those left behind, life could never be the same. Their voices carried into community halls, churches, and interviews, but always with the same echo. 2 women were gone, and nothing could bring them back. The absence of Alicia's guiding hand and Morgan's youthful energy was felt in every gathering, every quiet moment where their laughter used to be. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about love that turns violent, about families destroyed in seconds, about communities where fear silences justice, and about a legal system that must often choose between imperfect outcomes. It is not just a case about Norfolk. It is a mirror reflecting the fragility of safety in every community. And so, as we close the story of Alicia Ann Hereford and her daughter Morgan Bazemore, remember them not only as victims, but as a mother and daughter whose bond carried them to their final breath. Their lives mattered, their voices mattered, and their story must never be forgotten. If you stayed with us this far, honor their memory by keeping their story alive. Share this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so these voices, silenced in life, can continue to be heard. Together, we shine a light on stories that demand justice, that remind us of the cost of silence, and that keep alive the memory of those taken too soon. Like, share, subscribe, and never forget Alicia and Morgan.